clinical trials are really the focal point of gathering evidence on what treatments work and which treatments don't work. And so they're very important to the migraine community. Okay, so this is an overview of what we'll be talking about today. We'll be talking about what clinical trials are and why they matter. We'll talk about where ideas for new treatments come from. We'll talk about the phases and key components of developing new treatments. I'll say a few words about the ethics of clinical trials, and then review with you how I think people should think about whether they might want to be participants in a clinical trial. And I'll close with some comments on how people with migraine and other headache disorders can use the results of clinical trials to advocate for themselves to get better treatments. So clinical trials are medical experiments. And because they're experiments, that means that they're studies where the investigator or clinician scientist running the trial manipulates a key variable in the study. And of course, in clinical trials, the key variable is usually an active treatment versus placebo, or an active treatment versus another treatment. They're usually designed to answer three questions to assess the efficacy of a treatment. Does it work? To assess the tolerability of the treatment. Does it cause nuisance side effects? And the safety of the treatment. Does it cause significant harm? And of course, we're all looking for treatments that are effective and tolerable and safe. Usually clinical trials are designed to rigorously answer a single important question. And again, these are the questions I just ran through. Is the treatment effective, safe, or tolerable? And the comparison is often comparing a new treatment with placebo, a sugar pill, or comparing a new treatment with an older treatment. And as I mentioned already, clinical trials are the immediate foundation of science-based medical practice. So as much as possible, clinicians try to use treatments that are evidence-based treatments. And what that means is there are a couple of studies that show that the treatment works. So if in contemplating a clinical trial as an investigator or as a potential participant, there are a few key components. The first one is, what is the problem or the disease that we're studying? And for this webinar, we're going to assume the disease is migraine. We also need a candidate treatment, which is usually a drug, which could be an oral or an injectable or a patch or a nasal spray, or sometimes a device that's used to stimulate the brain, like occipital nerve, like transcranial magnetic stimulation, a device designed to stimulate the supraorbital nerves, like the Cephally device, and so forth. In addition to the treatment, we always need a comparison group, because clinical trials always ask, how does active treatment compare with something else? And most often it's a placebo or a sham treatment, but sometimes it's an active treatment. As most of you are aware, migraine therapies are divided into two broad groups: acute treatments, which are given at the time of the attack to relieve pain and restore function. And there, the question we ask is, treatment X effective in the acute treatment of migraine headaches? And for that purpose, we would most often measure the proportion of people who had moderate or severe pain when they treated, who have no pain or mild pain 1 hour later or 2 hours later. And we might also measure relief of bothersome symptoms that come along with migraine, like nausea, sensitivity to light, and sensitivity to sound. For preventive treatment, the goal of preventive treatment is to reduce the number and perhaps the severity of monthly migraine days or monthly headache days. And here people take treatment, keep track of the number of attacks they get, how long they last, how severe they are. And usually the question is, does treatment Y reduce the number of monthly migraine days? The development of drugs is conducted in a series of phases that's designed to protect the human beings who generously volunteer to participate in studies, and we'll get on to that in a minute. But what I want to do now is just take a second and talk about where ideas for treatments come from. So one place ideas for treatments come from is from preclinical science. So we study the biology of migraine, we identify strategies and targets, molecular mechanisms that are involved in migraine, and we try to develop drugs that attack those mechanisms. Oftentimes we find animal models for migraine and see if enhancing or disrupting particular mechanisms improves the migraine model. And when we finish doing that, we then go on to clinical science. So clinical science asks questions about diagnosis, treatment, and prevention. Here we're going to focus on acute and preventive treatment. This includes clinical trials, it includes epidemiologic studies, it may well include clinical pathologic correlations. And one of the ways ideas for new treatments emerge is from looking at how existing treatments work. So you'll see there's an arrow going backwards from clinical science to preclinical science. And there the idea is, well, we know that triptans work. We know how they work by acting on serotonergic mechanisms, but we also know that many of the oral triptans that are currently available may work too slowly for people or not work as well as we would like in people who have prominent nausea, perhaps because they can't absorb the pills. So that observation in clinical science sends us back to preclinical science, and we think, well, are there better ways to deliver the drugs we have? Would a nasal spray or an injection be better than a pill? And so in that way, we make progress both by identifying mechanisms, developing drugs that target those mechanisms, seeing what people like and don't like about the drugs, and then going back to preclinical science to develop better drugs as well. And that first step from preclinical science to clinical science is called translation step 1. And everyone now talks about translational research. And oftentimes for that first translational step, that means bringing scientific insights into clinical research to discover new treatments that work. And then there's also a second translational step as well, where we try to bring emerging clinical science from clinical trials into clinical practice. And it turns out there's often a long lag between what we discover in clinical trials and what we implement in clinical practice. And facilitating that process is called the second step of translational research. We do that through physician education, through patient education, by developing guidelines, and by modifying health systems to deliver the best possible care. And of course, the goal of this entire enterprise is to improve the outcomes that matter most to people with whatever disease we're talking about, in this case, migraine. So where do ideas come from? From preclinical science, we discover mechanisms and try to develop drugs that disrupt those mechanisms. We observe people with disease and redesign available treatments to deliver on unmet needs. Sometimes ideas come from coincidental observations. So for example, onabotulinum toxin A, or Botox, which is a widely used preventive for chronic migraine, was being used to treat wrinkles, and some smart dermatologists who were using it to treat wrinkles, made the observation that people with migraine getting Botox cosmetically experienced a reduction in their migraine days and migraine severity, and that led to a specifically designed program. Similarly, years ago, propranolol, whose brand name is Inderal, was used as a high blood pressure drug, and the observation was made that people with high blood pressure and migraine not only had their blood pressure lowered, but had their migraine improved. Sometimes we get ideas for new treatment from similarities with other diseases. So, for example, epilepsy and migraine are both brain diseases. They're both characterized by sensitive or hyperexcitable brains. And it turns out that some drugs that were developed to treat epilepsy, which reduces brain excitability, also work for migraine. So there's a large number of places where ideas for new drugs come from. And as those ideas emerge, they need to be tested in clinical practice. So the phases of developing a new treatment include, again, the preclinical phase. So, for example, there's a lot of science that says CGRP, calcitonin gene-related peptide, is an important molecule in migraine, and that high levels of CGRP occur in jugular blood during migraine attacks, that injecting CGRP into people with migraine triggers migraine attacks. And then there's been a lot of work in experimental animals showing that CGRP plays a critical role in transmitting pain in the nervous system. So that gave rise to the hypothesis that if we can block CGRP or block the receptor CGRP binds to, we might be able to treat migraine. So given that hypothesis, the next step is to develop treatments that hit that target. And as most of you know, there are 3 FDA-approved antibodies that target CGRP. There are at least 4 small molecules that can be taken orally from a class called GPANs that target CGRP. And then you test the treatment in animal models for safety, and that completes the end of preclinical testing. So now we have a hypothesis, we have a drug, we know the drug is safe in animals, we know the drug works in animal models, and now we're ready to move the drug into human studies. And to do that, we move on to phase 1 studies. So in a phase 1 study, that's the first time a new drug is given to human beings. New drugs are generally given to human beings who are healthy. And what we do is gradually escalate the dose in people to study the safety of drugs. So people who participate in phase 1 studies are very generous. Almost all the drugs that move to phase 1 prove to cause no harm or only minimal harm, but phase 1 establishes that drugs are safe in human beings. The next phase of research is phase 2, and in phase 2, people who have the disease of interest are actually given a drug for their disease. So in human beings, for example, in an early study of a CGRP targeted therapy, people might be given a range of doses of a CGRP blocking agent. And the purpose of that is to determine what's the optimal dose to help most people who have migraine. And then the other purpose is to test for safety and to get preliminary evidence for efficacy. Based on the phase 2 results, we conduct phase 3 studies. Phase 3 studies are large-scale testing. The purpose of phase 3 studies is generally to gain approval from the FDA, from the Food and Drug Administration. Often only 1 or 2 doses are tested in phase 3. Sometimes there's an active comparator in addition to placebo. And phase 3 results are presented to the FDA, and the FDA makes a decision. Is this treatment safe? Is this treatment effective? How should the drug be labeled so that doctors understand how to use it and patients understand how to use it, and also understand when it shouldn't be used in people with certain other conditions, and so forth. Phase 4, broadly, or post-marketing studies conducted after a drug is approved. And the goal there is to get evidence for how the drug works in real-world settings, in special populations, maybe older adults, maybe children, how it works in combination with other therapies as well. So the key elements of a clinical trial, and this applies to a phase 2 or a phase 3 study, or first of all, you have to have a protocol. And a protocol is like a recipe for how the clinical trial is going to be conducted. It tells you who's eligible to be in the study. It tells you how the experimental treatment is going to be given. It tells you how the results of treatment are going to be measured, both from to answer the question, does the treatment work and is the treatment safe? Research sponsors, who can be pharma companies or foundations or the NIH, or sometimes individual clinicians, write the protocol. And then the protocol is reviewed by an institutional review board whose purpose is to ensure that patient safety is respected. So people developing new treatments are often, for the best reasons in the world, and sometimes for not the best reasons in the world, are highly motivated to conduct their studies. IRB review ensures that the studies are ethically appropriate, that patients are protected and appropriately monitored. We need eligibility criteria. So who do we want to treat? So if we're doing a migraine prevention study designed to reduce the frequency of headache attacks, we might say, well, people need to have at least 4 or 5 attacks a month, so there's room to improve the attack frequency, and so that the people who are getting a preventive drug have an acknowledged need for it. Informed consent is very important. It's very important that patients who participate in trials understand the risks and benefits of the treatment and the alternatives, and that's a point I'll come back to. During the study, people are often given drug to take it home for acute treatment trials or preventive treatment trials. They're often asked to keep electronic diaries, either on smartphones they're given or on their own smartphones. The diary is used to measure both side effects and attack frequency and whether drug relieves pain. And then finally, a key component are clinical trials participants as well. So usually when I'm conducting a clinical trial at the Montefiore Headache Center, as I see patients, I look for patients who I think might benefit from participating in the study and might be eligible for the study. I will often ask people if they're interested in research. If they are, we'll determine eligibility. So do they have the right diagnosis? Do they have any things that would preclude their participating in the study? And if we determine eligibility and people agree to be in the study, then they're randomized to an active treatment and a comparator. One of the key components of clinical trials is this random allocation. So if you let people select which treatment they want, or you let the doctor select who gets what treatment, the two groups that are being compared, the group that's getting active treatment and the group that's getting comparative treatment, may be different. And by assigning people to groups with the toss of a coin, essentially, we ensure the groups are comparable. Blinding is another key component of a clinical trial. So blinding, single blinding means that the patient doesn't know what they're getting. Double blinding means that neither the doctor nor the patient knows what they're getting. And blinding is really important because people often go into studies with great hope that this new treatment they're trying will be the answer they've been seeking. And if they know they're getting that treatment, it may well work better than it would have without that knowledge. So who can participate in trials? All clinical trials have what are called inclusion criteria, factors that are necessary to permit someone to participate, and exclusion criteria, factors that might not allow someone to participate. So inclusion criteria could be your age, sometimes your sex, the type and stage of disease you have, your previous pattern of treatment, your laboratory values, other medical conditions you have, and other medications you might be taking. So the most important principle of clinical trials ethics is respect for autonomy. And what that means is that people have a right to make their own choices. But of course, to make a choice, that means that someone who is a potential participant needs to know all the facts about the study. It's also important not to pressure people to be in studies. So, my sense is that many of my patients have a desire to please me because they know I'm trying hard to help them, but that really pleasing me should not be a factor in a decision to participate in a trial, and pleasing any investigator should not be a factor. And researchers need to do everything possible to avoid harm, and everyone evaluating a clinical trial as a participant or as an investigator needs to conclude that the benefits of participation outweigh the risks. So if someone asks you to participate in a clinical trial, let me just summarize what I think the benefits are and what the risks are. And of course, for any particular decision, anyone asked to be in a trial needs to weigh the benefits and the risk. So one benefit is you get access to promising new approaches that aren't available outside a clinical trial. The drug, the vaccine, or the other intervention being studied may be more effective than the standard approach. Although it's important to remember that in most studies, you're not guaranteed getting the new and potentially better treatment because you might get a sham treatment or an ineffective dose. Participants get careful medical attention from research teams of doctors and other health professionals. And of course, if you participate in a trial, you're not charged for study-related treatment. So doctor visits, study medication is at no expense to you. You may get benefits from those treatments you receive directly, and the study may help others. So those are the reasons to participate. The risks are that the strategy under study might not actually be better than whatever the standard treatment would be. Sometimes new treatments have unexpected side effects or risks that are more severe than the risks that result from the standard of care. You may be asked to make more visits to the doctor than you would need if you weren't in a study. And when you agree to participate in a study, you agree to be randomized, meaning if we're comparing treatment A and treatment B, you don't get to choose treatment A or treatment B. You're assigned to treatment A or treatment B. But generally, one of the requirements to do a study is something called equipoise, which means if we're comparing two active interventions, it would be unethical to do the study if I knew active treatment A was better than active treatment B. And so that provides some comfort. So when you're deciding whether to participate in a trial, the questions are, what are the alternatives? What are the risks and benefits of participation? Who's conducting the study? Is it being conducted by someone you trust? Is it being sponsored by someone you trust? You should carefully read the consent form, which should contain all the risks and benefits. You can ask the question, will the study help me? Will the study help others? Did an ethics committee approve the study? And then a final thing is, my belief is that it's important if someone participates in a study and they get a treatment that helps them, that once the study is over, they should have continued access to that beneficial treatment. Sometimes that's the case, sometimes it isn't. So that's something you really need to look for. And then you want to ask, was the study well designed? And that's a difficult question sometimes for people who aren't healthcare professionals. When you're using a clinical trial to make a personal decision about treatment, that is. An important question to ask is, do the results of the study apply to people like me? So, for example, when I was making the decision about whether I should take aspirin, there's a huge study on the benefits of aspirin versus placebo in preventing heart attack and stroke called the Physician's Health Study. So that's a study that enrolled only men and enrolled male physicians about my age, and the results showed that aspirin was protective. So for me, the results of that study very much apply to me because I'm a male physician, but they wouldn't apply to a 30-year-old non-physician. They wouldn't apply to a female physician my age. So you have to ask, do the results of the study apply to people like me? You can ask the question, did the study measure the outcomes that I care about? And physician recommendations are often very helpful. So in summary then, here's the ground we've covered. We've talked about what clinical trials are. They're medical experiments designed to assess the efficacy and safety of treatments, either in comparison with placebo or other active drugs. They matter because they provide a scientific foundation for therapy. New ideas for treatment come from basic science, from looking at how people respond to available treatments and identifying unmet needs, from coincidental observations, and also by making arguments by analogy to other similar diseases. The drug development process goes through 4 phases. Once a target and a drug or a device have been identified, the first phase to assess safety, the second phase to get preliminary evidence of efficacy, the third phase to get a broader sense of safety and efficacy and meet the regulatory requirements of the FDA. Clinical trials are ethical if the benefits exceed the risks of participation, and that means carefully evaluating the treatment being offered and its alternatives. I think people who participate in clinical trials often help themselves and always help people with the same disease that's being studied, assuming the trial is well designed. So, when asked by my wife if she should participate in a migraine trial, I looked at the trial and my answer was certainly yes. But that's an individual judgment that should be based on the complex factors I just reviewed. And then when it comes to using the results of trials to get optimal treatment, it's important to make sure that you're like the patients enrolled in the study. And most of us would benefit from consulting a learned intermediary to help with that decision. So with that, those are the remarks I prepared, and I'd be happy to try to answer any questions that you have. Oh, I actually do have one more slide I was supposed to show. Forgive me. So the one more slide I was supposed to show was a thank you slide to the people who support the American Migraine Foundation. And those pharmaceutical companies are Amgen, who's a platinum sponsor, Eli Lilly and Teva, who are gold sponsors, and Allergan, who is a bronze sponsor. Their generosity helps the AMF provide factual information, advocacy tools, and a supportive community to people living with migraine. And for that, I think I speak for many of us, I am certainly very grateful, as is the American Migraine Foundation. Okay, thank you. Now I'm ready to answer questions. I think I see someone type in. So the first question is, how do you find out about studies or trials? So there's a number of ways to do that. One way is to go on to a federal website called clinicaltrials.gov. So the purpose of that website is that when anyone is going to conduct a clinical trial, the protocol for the trial needs to be registered by the government. A problem that existed a decade ago is that sometimes companies would conduct studies that would be negative and showing that their treatment didn't work and not present the results. So on clinicaltrials.gov, there's information about all the ongoing clinical trials in the United States. You can search by disease state, you can search by region of the country, and find trials that you might be eligible for. Another good way of doing it is to check with your doctor if you have a physician who's plugged into the headache community. But it's pretty easy to find trials, and certainly many people benefit from participating in studies. So there's another question popping up. And that question is, since many comorbid conditions left out of studies, how often are there further studies once there's FDA approval? So that's a very good question. So it is true that in phase 3 studies, the desire is to study eligible patients who don't have a multiplicity of other problems. So oftentimes we learn about treatment effects in people with comorbid or concomitant conditions in phase 4 and from post-marketing studies. So for example, some companies that make monoclonal antibodies to target CGRP might in phase 4 contemplate studying people who have migraine and some common comorbidity like asthma or depression or anxiety or another pain disorder. And there are sort of two questions really. One is treatment safe in the setting of the concomitant disorder? And usually for that, the answer is yes. And the other question is, well, if I have migraine and asthma and I take a CGRP monoclonal antibody and it makes my migraine better, might it make my asthma better as well? And so those sorts of questions are answered in phase 4 post-approval. And I saw another question, but it seems to have disappeared. So are there any other questions that people have about clinical trials? So how long does it typically take to determine the effects on pregnancy? I noticed the CGRP drugs have just released a cautionary warning against using them for the first 6 months of pregnancy. So safety in pregnancy is an issue for all drugs, but particularly for migraine therapies, because the majority of people with migraine in the United States are women of childbearing potential. So there have been some, and one of the requirements for participating in a clinical trial is that you have to be using an effective means of contraception to participate. So in phase 3, the goal is to avoid exposure in pregnancy. One of the things about CGRP monoclonal antibodies is that they stick around in the body for a very long time. So the good news is that of the 3 FDA-approved antibodies, all 3 of them are available with monthly administration, and one of them is available with administration every 3 months. So that's that long interval between drug treatments is a huge advantage in terms of convenience. It's a huge advantage in terms of adherence, making it easy to take the drug the way your doctor recommended. But what it means is that the drugs stick around for a long time. So if the average CGRP antibody has a half-life of, say, 4 weeks, that means that 20 weeks later, the drug is 95% gone. And it's sort of that thinking that's the basis of the advice to avoid the drug if you're planning on getting pregnant in the next 6 months. So we don't know what we don't know. So there is not evidence I'm aware of that these drugs would cause adverse effects in pregnancy, but we certainly don't have evidence that they're safe. So clearly the better part of valor is to wait. My belief is that everybody who develops a new migraine drug will establish a pregnancy registry where women who get pregnant while on therapy will enroll while still pregnant, and then the registry will track the pregnancy outcomes to see if there's any suggestion that the drug causes trouble in pregnancy. And so we don't have that data yet, and it's an important cautionary note, and one of the questions that can't really be answered until we're doing post-marketing studies. Any other questions? Are there any new investigator-led trials for dietary supplements in migraine? So there are a number of dietary supplements that are evidence-based treatments. And so, one of my personal favorites is riboflavin, vitamin B2. And there is an excellent study by Jean Chernin showing that 200 milligrams of vitamin B2 twice daily is effective in the prevention of migraine. And B2 is a natural product I use quite a bit. I think magnesium has a role orally in migraine prevention. Its only common side effect is loose bowel movements and sometimes diarrhea. So I think that's a reasonable thing to use. I think coenzyme Q10 has some suggestive evidence for efficacy, and it's worth using. So those are my 3 favorite supplements. I'm not aware of big ongoing studies with supplements, but I do think natural products have an important role and are underutilized. So I'm going to answer a question that wasn't asked about clinical trials of devices. So there are several FDA-approved devices for migraine. So one of the devices that I alluded to earlier is the Cephally device. So Cephally is like a TENS unit, transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation. For Cephally, the device is applied so that the supraorbital nerves, the nerves right above the eye, are electrically stimulated. That device, which was originally approved as a preventive treatment, is now also approved as an acute treatment. The second device that I'll comment on is single pulse transcranial magnetic stimulation. So that's a device that you apply to the back of the head. It applies a pretty strong magnetic field to the back of the head. And that is a device that was originally approved as an acute treatment for migraine that is now also approved as a preventive. The third device is the external vagal nerve stimulation device, which is currently approved as an acute treatment, but there are ongoing randomized trials assessing VNS as a preventive treatment. And what I'll say about all 3 of these treatments is that they don't involve drugs. The treatment is with electrical or magnetic stimulation. They all have quite remarkable safety records. As far as we know, there are not overuse syndromes that can develop with devices the way they can with drugs. And broadly speaking, both in practice and in studies, I think devices are a very good treatment option for people with migraine. I'll also say that in doing the studies, blinding is much harder, because if you're giving a drug, it's easy to make a sugar pill. But with a device, blinding is a little harder because with the device, you feel the stimulation, you feel something when treatment is being given. And many companies that make devices have gone to great lengths to maintain that principle of double blinding when they do their device studies. So I'll pause for one more minute to see if there are any additional questions. And seeing none, let me thank the American Migraine Foundation for supporting this talk and their sponsors for the financial commitment that made it possible. I do think, people refer to clinical trials sometimes just as drug tests or as studies, but as we try to move towards an evidence-based medicine for people with migraine, clinical trials really provide the scientific foundation for evidence-based medicine. One of the challenges in treating migraine, both in clinical trials and in clinical practice, is that migraine is a very heterogeneous disorder. So some people have chronic migraine with 15 or more days a month. Some people have episodic migraine with lower headache frequencies. Some people have aura or not aura. Some people have allodynia. Many people have a variety of comorbidities. And my best guess is that these different subtypes of migraine differ in biologically meaningful ways. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we have all these treatments that are quite effective for some people, but not for everybody. And so part of my frustration as a headache practitioner, and I'm sure many of my patients have this as a frustration when they seek treatment, is that we're not very good at matching a particular patient to a particular treatment. So to some degree in headache practice, currently there's a trial and error process as we find the treatment that's right for a particular person. So one of my hopes for clinical trials going forward is that we'll not only ask the question, well, does this treatment work for people with migraine or chronic migraine, but instead we'll ask, how do we identify the people with migraine for whom this is really a great treatment? And if we ask that question, we may be able to personalize medicine better. We may be able to get treatment right the first time, and we may be able to shorten that period of trial and error as clinician and patient work together to optimize treatment. And with that, again, I'd like to thank you for your attention and the American Migraine Foundation and its sponsors for this opportunity.